Hello, I'm Stephen Matchett from Campus Morning Mail, and this is Expert Opinion, where we ask people who know what's going on in research, what's going on. Expert Opinion is brought to you by Twig Marketing, Australia's original higher ed marketing consultancy. Got a brand issue or a message that isn't getting out? Talk to Tim Winkler, tim@twigmarketing.com. And thanks to producer Amanda Johnson from Twig, who makes Expert Opinion happen. For listeners picking up this signal on Mars, there's a new product called ChatGPT out there. Microsoft is investing and Google has a competitor right behind. They are, I am told, generative pre-trained transformer language models, and they use deep learning techniques to generate human-like responses to just about any question that can be answered from information on the internet. For learning and teaching, it's either going to be assessment Armageddon or a help to academics everywhere. It depends who you ask. But what does the tech mean for the research community, for researchers and grant agencies, for policymakers and journal publishers, and for the keepers of the giant databases of articles and citations, say Scopus? I doubt anybody really knows yet, but I'm talking today to one bloke who will have a good idea of the questions stakeholders in the research community should be asking, and that's Tim Cahill. Dr. Cahill is Managing Director of Consultancy Research Strategies Australia, and he's spent years in the engine room of research management at the ARC as an advisor to universities and discipline lobbies across the STEM and HASS spectrums. Good morning, sir. Thanks for sparing the time.
Morning, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
I understand it was a little wet down your way yesterday.
It was quite a lot of rain here yesterday, but everything seems to have recovered this morning.
Excellent. Can I start by asking, what are the questions DVC's research should be asking themselves just now?
I think there's really fundamentally only one question that DVCs are, PVCs are, research directors, anyone who's thinking about how this is going to impact on managing their research agenda. And that is, how do we harness these technologies and how do we use these to leapfrog both our competitors, other universities, other researchers, but also to leapfrog some of the knotty questions that we've had in science and research for decades. I think whoever harnesses these technologies first, and we can go into detail about what some of the technologies are beyond ChatGPT in particular, but whoever can harness these first is going to have an order of magnitude advantage over everyone else, in my view, Stephen.
As I understand it, the ChatGPT, which Microsoft's investing heavily, I think it put $8 billion extra just into, the Google one that's right behind, they can all access what's available on the open to all internet, correct?
That is correct, up until 2021 in the case of ChatGPT. So nothing post 2021, and it's not clear yet to me what Google Bard is ingesting. Okay,
but so a vast amount of data and knowledge people need is going to be in proprietary databases.
That's true, and this is one of the limitations of GPT-3, the model that underpins ChatGPT. But GPT-3 and ChatGPT have already run up against some limitations in their use cases. So even in my own testing, asking ChatGPT to identify academic sources or conduct something like a literature review, you've got to remember, as you say, it was trained on what's available, and a lot of the academic research is tied up in proprietary databases that are not readily accessible, so they haven't been included. It has, however, ingested quite a lot of material in books, which it has had access to clearly, but the limitation, therefore, is that not only does it not have access to those bits of information in the first place, but B, it's a generative probabilistic based language program. or model, which effectively means that it looks at a word and says, what word is likely to come after this word? So when you ask it for a task that seems simple in our Google kind of search engine paradigm of thinking, which is what are some references about topic A or B, it will actually generate invented references based on what it thinks the likely combination of words in a particular order might look like. And they're very plausible, they're highly plausible. So I've, from my own world, asked it a few questions and asked it what references it's utilising. And it's got plausible article names in the right journals for the topic that I'm talking about, even by authors that I know and colleagues and friends of mine, but the articles are completely fictitious.
That's fantastic.
So it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's putting things in the right order. It's got the names in the right order. They're good names. It's got journal titles that are the right ones. They're the big ones in the field. The bibliometrics in the case that I was testing it. And again, the titles are completely plausible and on point, but they're entirely fictitious. If you cross-check them against somebody's, the listed author's publication records, they do not exist.
Joe, that could create problems for research assessment processes. I imagine the ARC might want to have a bit of a look at that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just points to the limitation of the use case of ChatGPT for that purpose. But, and this is where some of the other tools that I referred to earlier come into it, there are a suite of startups that are building academic search tools on top of those big language models. So they're actually harnessing the model to achieve the tasks.
Is that going to be going on now in the big database providers or the big journal companies that are diversifying into data management?
Quite probably. I suspect that some of these startups will get acquired by the likes of Elsevier and others. Some of them will successfully generate business models and be viable in their own right. It's a tough space to have a viable business model, and some of them will just disappear into obscurity.
Because that is one thing that the higher education community debate in general hasn't really seemed to realise, that these things are going to have to generate income. Everyone just seems to assume that ChatGPT is this universal resource, even though they now have an added version which charges, I don't know, $20 a month. But it's some sort of, it's something in the commons, which of course clearly it can't be.
No, that's right. And if you think about it from the perspective of Microsoft, and they've effectively come out and said this, what they're really doing with ChatGPT is bringing down the profit margin that Google gets on search. That's the commercial decision behind investing so heavily in that is level the playing field for Bing by bringing down Google's business model effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you ask ChatGPT to write you an essay about how do we a company's lunch, the answer would be what they're doing to Google.
Yeah, that's right. And so a lot of these smaller companies that we're seeing in the academic search space, and there are a few. There's one called elicit.org, ssite.ai, consensus.app, and another one called SciSpace. Particularly SciSpace and elicit.org are building explicitly on top of GPT-3. So they are utilising the model, but retraining it or fine-tuning it, I suppose, for use cases in academic search. And they are doing some amazing things. I mean, I try and tell you what they're doing, but it's really hard to keep up because every day they've done something new and amazing with it. But basically, they're feeding in abstracts and full text from open access databases and using the GPT-3 model over the top of those data sets to fine-tune it for academic search purposes. They're already experimenting in generating summaries of papers, identifying the best papers, et cetera, et cetera.
Which goes to what I hope is a core question, but let me introduce it by asking, let's assume they'd been, the developers had been 2 or 3 years ahead of where they are now. And they had said to all the journal publishers at the start of the pandemic, open your files, open your databases to us and give it to, and we'll put it in the model there. I mean, would that, who could tell, but could that have made a difference in terms of development times?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a few other use cases out there that have been around, at least in the public forums, for a little bit longer. And you can see the impact that those are starting to have. Again, we can talk about them, but the ability of AI in other spaces, so not GPT-3, but AI to identify entirely new materials in collaboration with scientists, AI to predict the structure of proteins, AI as an applicant on patents, having completely generated through adversarial neural networks patent application documents. So, you know, these use cases have been around for a little while, and nobody's really talking about those, but those are where the big impacts are actually going to be for the research agenda.
The Google man who suggested their earlier model was sentient was said to be too early, but that's starting to get to sound a little like it.
Yeah, so if we go back a couple of years, there's a group of patent attorneys, basically, and they have created a project called, let me just get this right, DABUS, the Device for the Autonomous Bootstrapping of Unified Science, Sentience. And what they've done is that they've trained an AI to generate patents. And the reason they've done that is to test the ability of an AI to be named as an inventor on a patent. That's their interest in it. But the technique and the patents are fairly trivial, but the patents themselves meet all of the benchmarks that a patent has to meet, but it's entirely generated by an AI.
So these are existing ideas that someone's had. No?
No, these ideas were generated by the AI.
Okay. So does that down the track, when, I don't know, the amount of data is bigger or the computing time's larger, does that get to a point where you basically ask your AI, what do we need to think of next in molecular biology?
Absolutely. And I mean, this is what we're seeing in some of these other examples. So in 2022, so last year, we saw DeepMind predict the structure of almost every protein catalogued by science thus far in 18 months. So, you know, the entire catalogue that we've developed around the structure of proteins, DeepMind predicted and replicated that work within 18 months.
And DeepMind is whose?
DeepMind is a standalone company. So it's a UK-based AI company.
Okay, now what happens if it makes a mistake? Who's going to know?
Well, this is part of the ethical aspect of this, which we haven't really worked out yet. What are the checks and balances? What's the quality assurance that we put over this stuff? Similarly, we've got the example out of University of Liverpool, I believe it was, a couple of years ago, where effectively they've massively reduced the time and effort required to discover new materials by employing an AI. But it points to what the changing nature of research will be and the changing role of a researcher.
Mm.
So a lot of research, as we know it, is stuff that can now be replicated by AI, from the generation of text, which is the relatively simplistic GPT-3 chat GPT piece of the pie, through to discovery, which we've got in the case of that proteins example from DeepMind or the University of Liverpool new materials discovery piece. So what then becomes the role of the researcher when you've got these bits of their current workflow taken over by AIs? And for me, it's really interesting, because I think it means that the work of the researcher strictly comes down to the creative, future-looking human piece that only humans can do. And that's a really exciting space. But again, contingent upon being able to harness these tools properly and build them into your workflow. And again, whoever does that across the board first is going to be leaps and bounds ahead of the competition.
Let me try and phrase this slowly, because I'm not as smart as you, and I'm not as smart as the technology. This could then mean you save yourself a bunch of time in searching for new ideas by asking the right questions and getting a sense of where the dead ends predictively might be?
Correct. And with the twin developments of these tools coming online, so you point the tools towards the right questions, and open access increasing and more of the world's content becoming available to those AIs to point them towards and train them on in the first place. And, you know, big data generally becoming ubiquitous. But those two developments in tandem mean fundamentally that the role of the researcher is pointing the AIs to the right questions. Exactly right.
Which has implications beyond measure for staffing requirements, skills requirements, and budgets.
Absolutely. Also, the entire infrastructure of how university research is supported inside a university is built in a completely different paradigm, a very slow paradigm. We're talking about a paradigm shift to a very fast-moving paradigm.
But it puts, in a country like Australia at the moment, where the great unspoken debate that's going on under the, if you can have an unspoken debate, about the future for discovery research, which is not exactly flavour of the month at the moment, it puts that into an entirely different context.
Yep, absolutely. It also puts our relationship with China into an entirely different context. A lot of the AI is going to come out of China, and the biggest data sets are sitting in Chinese organisations. So part of our ability to leverage that relationship in a research sense is really going to open up new avenues and opportunities for Australia as a nation.
Tell me more. Tell me about that. I mean, if you'd, I'd have just assumed the Yanks were sitting on, most of the data, and the Europeans. So, what's the PRC got that we haven't got, as it were?
Massive population, massive surveillance culture, lots of investment in AI and tech, and a much more developed. You might not believe this, but I've done this research for a client as recently as 6 months ago, but a much more mature, responsible AI regulatory landscape. So they're really, really well positioned to partner with Australia on these kinds of things.
And does this work at a discipline level? Like, will they have a whole bunch of raw material information on quantum computing research?
Absolutely. They'll have just data sets that we can't even comprehend. One of the advantages that we have in Australia is that we already have a very, very deep collaborative relationship with Chinese research organisations. I did a piece of work not long ago for another client about our collaborations with China, I think don't quote me on this. I'll direct
a lot of people are going to be reading that, seeing this. So
I'll direct listeners to the report when it comes out.
Yeah.
But I think institution-wise, the fifth biggest, or at least in the top 6 or 7 contributors to Australia's research output in terms of named institutions is a Chinese organisation. That's the 5th or 6th biggest contributor to Australia's research capability, is a Chinese organisation, research organisation.
There are plenty of public stats that indicate that, you know, the PRC institutions are right up there. That I don't think ahead of the US, but I could be wrong, but rivaling the EU in some places. Although take that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, definitely. And look, I think there was a piece of work, I can't remember where it came out of, maybe UTS last year or the year before, which, if you cut the figures in a particular way, looks like China is Australia's single biggest national collaborator in terms of research publishing.
Yeah. Now, discipline areas, this sounds to me like it could be certainly a lot more than STEM, but there'd be a whole lot of human-based disciplines that there's infinite data out there that with questions around we haven't even occurred to.
Yep, absolutely. And again, the coming online of open access means that the models are being fine-tuned or refined for these use cases. And it just takes a few clever people to come up with a way of doing something interesting with that. And suddenly, again, it just shifts the entire paradigm of how research will be done.
So how do the for-profit publishers with the big databases, how do they stay in the game? I mean, it sounds to me like they can't just try and keep everything behind a paywall.
Yeah, so you look at the Nature Springer group and what they've done with digital science, and I think that sets the model for what the others are now trying to replicate. But basically, they're maybe a decade or more ago now, they cottoned onto the idea that the end-to-end scientific workflow is going to be digital. And they started acquiring and stitching together portfolio companies that would effectively represent the end-to-end workflow of science, certain aspects of science at least. And they've been quite successful in generating new products and new ways of working based on those tools. And most universities in Australia will have a subscription to one or more of the tools offered by that company. So that's going to be the way, I think, that they're going to stay relevant, is to then acquire a lot of these kinds of startups that I mentioned at the start of this, like illicit.org, maybe not because it's .org, but SciSpace, Site.ai, as they did in the last few years with a lot of the open access repositories to supplement what they're doing there. So that's going to be, I think, what we see unfolding in the landscape. But again, for research organizations, the important thing is how can they actually harness these tools to accelerate their research agendas. And I haven't really seen anyone in Australia, at least, getting across that agenda.
And what does it mean for their staffing requirements?
I don't think it means a reduction in staff. I think it means, as we've seen with automation, it means the elevation of relatively menial tasks in automation to a higher order set of skills, retraining and redeploying staff into other roles. Similar things going to happen here, I suspect.
It means new roles.
It means new roles. It means reskilling people and giving them new roles.
I mean, it means a lot of people are going to have to rethink a lot of stuff about their discovery methods.
Absolutely. And it means, again, that whole research support infrastructure that's spread across libraries and research offices is going to have to, A, be reconfigured to accommodate these tools, B, reconfigured to factor in the speed at which discovery is going to happen, because discovery is going to be accelerated because of this.
So What's the bad news?
Look, the bad news is I interviewed for a couple of senior roles in universities around 2019, and what I put to them was twofold. A, that they needed to worry very deeply about their reliance on cross-subsidising their research portfolios from international student revenue in the event that somehow disappeared, and B, that they needed to harness the power of AI before it was too late and their competitors got the jump on them. That was in 2018, 2019. I didn't get those roles and have never applied for roles since because I was told I was a disruptor. Fast forward 12 to 24 months in the future, and both those relatively obvious to me scenarios played out in ways I never could have imagined. I wasn't predicting COVID, but I certainly was pointing out the fragility of the cross-subsidisation, and I certainly was pointing out the crest of the wave of AI-based discovery tools that were coming, and I was called a disruptor and told that I wouldn't get any job like that. That's the downside. That's the attitude that we have to combat, Stephen. And I think it will take a lot of cultural change to accommodate these AI tools.
But change now happens. I mean, you're way younger than me. God knows everybody is. But change now happens at a speed pretty much inconceivable to anyone who grew up when I did. I mean, if people from another galaxy arrive, with about in a fortnight, we'd just say, "Oh yeah, they're the aliens." Buy them a coffee when you see them. I mean, what is there not now? Is there not now a sense that really the game is changing all the time, and that models just have to adapt?
There is, but unfortunately, the funding model for universities means that central resources for strategic, long, or even medium to long-term change programs simply don't exist. DVCs still don't have buckets of money big enough to achieve the institution-wide change that will be meaningful. There are localised changes that can happen, and this is where a lot of my work happens now, down with individual research centres, for example, or discrete organisational units where change can be rolled out across a discrete unit. But for a university-wide change of the magnitude that we're talking, the research portfolio still doesn't have sufficient centralised strategic funding to achieve it.
And is that going to be the challenge, or is it rather going to be the cost of the tech? It doesn't sound to me like NCRIS now needs to go out and buy 27 supercomputers.
No, look, the cost of cloud computing is a great example. The cost of that is pretty marginal in the grand scheme of things these days. I mean, I can jump online and buy some with a few cents if I need it. Similarly, if you look at the business model sitting behind GPT-3, I think to access the most costly model that they've got out at the moment, which is the one that ChatGPT is built on, we're talking fractions of a cent in order to access that in a meaningful way. They give you, I think, $18 US free credit. I think I calculated, I can't remember how many words, but it was millions and millions of words that you could generate with that $18 credit. So we're talking about marginal costs here, right? These are business models that are predicated on scale.
Yeah. Someone said to me the other day that people are missing the point that this is really about giving consumers the opportunity to tell which air fryer they want to buy. And this is where the real change will happen, but it's in some ways it's tangential.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think cost is an issue anymore. It's really
mindset
and convincing people or showing people that this is an advantageous way to work.
Where's the leadership going to have to come from?
Look, it's there. I don't think it's a leadership question. I really think it's a a resourcing question. And it goes back to something that's beyond the control of the universities at the moment, which is how our research portfolios are funded. And they're still largely funded from ARC, NHMRC and MRFF grants, i.e. discrete grants with a start and a finish date for a single project awarded to one or a small group of researchers. And that mentality of having a project-based approach to knowledge discovery, as opposed to what I call a program-based approach, that is a strategic agenda played out over a long period of time with a large bucket of money, as long as we're still project-based in how our university and other research is funded, there's not going to be a bucket of money which is strategic and large enough to roll out programs of work.
So it becomes an old-fashioned governance question.
It does. It does. And you can see an organisation like CSRO is trying to bridge the gap in many ways with some of their agendas. So they've got things like the future science platforms. They've got things like the missions that are being rolled out. And that's a way of trying to orient resources towards particular common agendas, i.e. build programs of work as opposed to just being the sum of your parts. But again, unless they're accompanied by big buckets of money, the opportunity is always going to be where the money is. And at the moment, that's ARC, NHMRC and MRFF grants.
Do you need to decouple it from specific industries? I mean, the potential for the Reconstruction Fund nominates 6 or 7 industry areas. So you'll decouple it from that, and even decouple it from existing functions like the Medical Research Future Fund is going to, lift life expectancy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you need to take it away from that way of thinking, which is what you need now to convince Treasury, and certainly convince the Productivity Commission, and then just change it away and say we just need to commit money to a methodology or to a science track? That makes sense.
Potentially, we need to make good on the debate we've had for lots of years now, going back to at least the first time Kim Carr was a minister in this space, which was around differentiation and specialisation. We need to inject sufficient, again, centralised strategic resources into universities that they can achieve differentiation and specialisation. And not everyone's going to agree with me on that. And certainly the group of 8 aren't going to think that's a great idea for them. Maybe for others they do, I'm not sure. But that's really what needs to occur. So you've got deep concentrations of specializations in kind of localized areas that can be deployed in combination with each other, rather than what we've got at the moment, which is lots of specialization across the board, but atomized throughout our 40 or so universities.
But the Capex now is in pursuit of given areas and with given targets. Yeah, we will lead the world in whatever, or we will lift GDP by doing X. This is, if I'm getting it, it becomes a question of saying, we just need this resource so that everybody in this given institution or whatever can go off and explore stuff, because we don't know it's going to go, but we know it's going to go somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is the fact that it has to be done in deep collaboration with industry. So the ability of universities to make good on the commercial applications of this stuff, and let's be honest, that's where the benefits are going to be realised, is in the application of this stuff, and the application in most research use cases is going to be in a money-making setting of some sort, unless we've got industry guiding that fundamental discovery towards the areas of commercial value. We're really not going to see this bear any fruit. I think I've mentioned this to you before, Stephen, but in my world, universities are still the special home of discovery research, less and less as the Googles of the world take on greater and greater shares of that. But universities can and should still be about fundamental discovery, but it should be directed by where the commercial or non-commercial, but where the real needs are. And until you marry those two things up, you're not going to get any benefits realised from whatever we do in this space. So I think there's a study done a few years ago in the US, and I think it just bears out the point that we talk a lot about the responsibility of universities for commercialisation of research. In the US, where we think about them being particularly better than us at the commercialisation of research, and we talk about it, we point to it all the time, I think the figure was something like they only capture 16% of the potential value of their research back inside of universities. So there's a limit on what universities can do here. So it has to be done in tandem and in coalition with industry and others.
What do you tell if the minister calls you tomorrow on Monday? What do you tell him or her?
Look, there are a lot of moving parts that have to match up for this all to come together. And we've talked for decades now about research or universities in isolation from the other big portfolios that need to be involved in that discussion, which are our industrial policy and our employment policy and our export policy. All of those three portfolios need to be matched up with our research R&D portfolio in order for the forces to align and for us to make good on the promise of what research can do for this nation.
The couple of the learned academies are proposing that in budget submissions, precisely that.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's the only way that we're going to see any big shifts in the economic base of the country.
Tim Cahill, this is overall strikes me as being pretty good news.
I think so. Back to your question about where's leadership going to come from, leadership's going to come from that political level, I think, in the first instance. We've seen over, again, going back at least the 20 or so years of my time in this game, we've seen the tail wagging the dog's not quite right, but we've seen policy being highly responsive to certain signals that are coming from the research organisations. So we saw that with ERA, for example, which, as you know, I was intimately involved in, but the methodology of ERA was completely ground up in terms of its use of citations. It didn't invent the use of citations for this. It didn't invent the use of ranked journals as a way of measuring the quality of research. It took that lead from the academic community. I think a similar policy imagination needs to look at some of these signals coming out of academia now and build policies on top of them.
Should Margaret Shields' review of the ARC be looking at this in terms of entirely new metrics to measure research output?
Knowing Margaret, Mark and Sue, who are involved in that at the highest level, I'm absolutely certain they're across it all.
This is going to be lots of fun watching this. It really is. Tim Cahill, thank you for your time. I know how busy you are, and you've been very generous. That's Steve. I'm Stephen Matchett from Campus Morning Mail. That's Tim Cahill talking about ChatGPT and what will follow, and we're out.